Welcome to Intersections. I'm Dion Stevens. This is a space where we bring together the real world and the world of research to examine topics that are often understudied and misunderstood.
So I'm really excited to be doing this lecture, Black College Women, Partner Availability and Sexual Risk, not only because it ties directly to my broad area of research that I've been doing for quite a few years, but I think because it's something that is talked about a lot at a personal level among my friends and peers and family members. And also we see it being discussed more and more in broader popular culture and social media. It's a really interesting topic because it ties together these intersections about age of development, which is emerging adulthood to adulthood.
Four Belvedere Valentinis for four beautiful ladies.
Thank you. I want to make a toast.
Yes.
We may not have everything we want at the moment, but we do have each other. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Oh, Kenya, this is fabulous.
Okay, let's get down to business. Where are the brothers?
Thank you. Where's the eye candy?
Ooh, you gotta keep on
Honey. Okay, Shantae. Oh my.
And that is why we are the 42.4%.
The what?
42.4% of Black women have never been married.
I read that article. It didn't say we'd never get married. It just said we have yet to.
Okay, so when is it gonna happen in the afterlife, please?
Well, even if 42.4% of us never get married, that still means 57.6 of us will, and that's a substantially greater percentage.
Thank you, Miss Numbers Queen. It's very impressive. However, those odds are completely against us. It says the phenomenon is most acute among African American women who are educated professionals. Judge, accountant, banker, pediatrician, that BS.
I'm just tired of being classified as a victim. Single Black professional woman destined to be unhappy and alone. I mean, I just have to keep believing I'll find the one.
True.
I don't even need all that. I just want a good brother.
That's right.
He doesn't have to make a lot of money so long as he's got a job.
Yes,
He just has to be taller than me, college educated, and not crazy. No kids, good teeth, and no kinky sex. I mean, I like to switch it up a bit, but, you know, what?
You're doing it again.
The list, Kenya, the list. You know what? You should have stayed with Rashid Muhammad.
I couldn't do the Muslim chauvinist thing.
Whatever, girl. Rashid was fine, okay? I would have been a bean pie eating, mosque going, walking 5 steps behind his behind, wearing a burqa.
Listen, I've been listening to this new CD by Dr. LaWanda Phillips. Now, she says if we keep hanging on to this preconceived notion of what we think we want, that we're actually cutting ourselves off from our universal abundance. See, we hold on so tight to this image that we have of our IBM. Ideal Black man. But she says that we've got to let go in order to let love flow. In fact, that's what it's called. Let go, let flow. That means you, Kenya. No more lists.
Let go, let flow.
That's right.
Yes, and it's a whole lot better than keep hope alive.
That's right. Okay, y'all.
The universe is listening. Let flow.
Perfect, my love.
Yes. So as long
The intersections of gender expectations, the isms that relate to race, social class, education, and then also the idea about sexual risk and how it's so much pronounced in terms of the research around Black women and their health. What I like to start off this talk with when I do it is the movie Something New. And of course, this is a broader story about a very successful Black woman and her search for love, which includes dating a Black man, but more central to the story is her negotiations around culture and her own beliefs about dating a white man, which is part of what we're going to be discussing today. But I think this clip, in terms of its discussion with her 4 friends who are highly successful, really sort of helps frame the broader issues that I want to talk about today as it relates to Black college women, partner availability, and sexual risk. Now, as I said earlier, the issues related to Black women and sexual risk have been widely studied in the research. But what's interesting is that most of the research tends to focus on community samples and lower income Black women's experiences. And this has a lot to do with the research around who's at risk, what populations are easiest to access and gather data from, etc. But what's central to a lot of these discussions are the ways in which financial stability and material resources are seen as ways of protecting women from risk. So for example, if you have access to education, you should have more skills and knowledge to avoid getting negative sexual health outcomes such as HIV, unintended pregnancies, etc. Or if you have financial resources, you can better pay for services that will help you avoid these types of issues. However, the research shows that Black women still experience higher rates of negative sexual health outcomes, even among those who have higher levels of education. And what we're talking about here is either a college or university degree, and also we'll talk about women who also have graduate level degrees as well. And when you compare their experiences to their cohort in terms of the education levels, it's showing that it's still replicating in a lot of ways similar disparities that are happening at different levels of education and socioeconomic status. So it's important to think about that and think about the ways in which things that we tend to look at as protective factors, education and socioeconomic status, might not be holding true for a number of reasons. Now, one of the areas that I think is important to look at is the concept of partner availability and your partnerships and relationship goals, because we know that's the source of negative sexual health outcomes in our interpersonal relationships. But I think it's important to start off by stressing that the narrative that around marriage and Blacks is really not fitting with what the research is showing. What we do know is that Black college students do want to marry. And this is for both males and females. They have positive attitudes towards the idea of marriage and being a long-term committed relationship, whether it's formal ceremony or having this type of dynamic in relationship. And we see that it's something that's been consistent. What we do know is that since the 1960s, Black women are marrying later in life. And also their rates of marriage have decreased. So they're less likely to marry compared to other women in their age group and across, when you're looking at it across racial cohorts. Further, they have higher rates of marital instability. And further along, we'll talk a little bit more about this. The other thing that's found among Black college students is that in predominantly white institutions, they tend to have higher rates of having non-monogamous relationships, meaning that they might be engaging in hookups or engaging in relationships where there's multiple partners around one partner. But again, that really is tied to structural differences. For example, if you look at the research around students at historically Black colleges and universities, their relationships, beliefs, and even their perception of partner availability are very different than Black college women at predominantly white institutions. So it's important to think about the ways in which social and economic environments really shape both not just our beliefs around marriage and partner availability, but even the type of risks that we are exposed to in the context that increase our risks. So going back to this concept of partner availability, this is something that's talked a lot about. And what we're talking about with partner availability is the number of potential partners people perceive are out there. And these potential partners are based on desirable traits or similarities and attractiveness, not just physical attractiveness, but what's important to identifying who your partner will be. So there might be a large pool of men, but if it's not men who have the resources or the attractiveness or the personality traits, then there aren't a lot of partner availability. So for college women, Black college women specifically, when we're talking about partner availability, we're talking about partners who will have resources and possibly education levels that are similar to their own or higher, because this again goes back to beliefs about gender role expectations. So when you're looking at it typically for partner availability, we tend to look at similarity in background and mobility factors in terms of social mobility, which include things like their personality traits, their income, education, attractiveness, etc. And then of course, what is preferred for males is somewhat different than it is for females, because this ties into gender roles. Now, it's really important to think about partner availability for Black women, because the research has clearly shown that finding a partner is key to determining their social mobility, and that's above and beyond their education or economic achievements. So it's really important to think about who their partner is, because it doesn't matter how much money they make, for them to move generally into higher levels of social mobility, the secondary income or the support of the partner or different ways are going to be key to determining how far they can move socially in term and economically as they move up their lifespan. And if you're looking at this again in terms of economics, you could see the impact of it in terms of Black women. So there are large numbers of equal numbers of Black males and females in the emerging adulthood phase, which is emerging adulthood, I should stress, is 18 to 29. Some people say 24, it depends on which emerging adulthood researcher. But basically during the age where most people are looking for a long-term monogamous partner, looking to get married, or at least starting those types of relationships. And if you're looking at economically, you can see that for Black women, when it looks in that way, the shift changes. So there might be a lot of Black males in their context, but they might not be Black males who are in their same stage in terms of their economic income and strength, and also their social status. So they might not have jobs that are equal to them. They might not have the same social status, live in the same types of communities, etc. So for example, the research shows for Black women who make 100,000 or over, and we're looking at that, Black women are the only group who outnumber men of the same ethnicity. So if you're looking, for example, for white women, there are 450 white men that make 100,000 and over come for every 100 women. So of course this has to do with institutional racism, access to economic jobs and other factors. But when you're looking at it cross-culturally, Black women are the only group that when you hit this upper middle class income bracket, there's more Black women making that kind of money as compared to Black men. And if you're looking at the age of 30 to 34, which is just above the age of marriage typically in the United States and for Black women, that's where the greatest gap is for Black middle class women in terms of economics as well. So what you're finding is these are the pressure, of course, your childbearing years, but what you're finding is that more highly educated women are earning more than Black men of the same age group. But what you're finding is for white women, you're not finding this big disparity. So white men are maintaining the gender role expectation that they're getting more money, etc. But for Black women, there are more than 25% more Black women than Black men in this income gap when you're looking at terms of the $42,000 to $75,000 range. So anything between 42, even over 100,000, there's a huge disparity between males and females partnerships in the Black community. Now, if you're looking at this longitudinally, we could see that this has implications in terms of what's the expectations and a bit of possibilities for living on certain incomes in the United States. So this concept of the marriage gradient, which is essentially where people marry up or down by education. So the gradient is basically the degree to which there's a difference. And typically, when you're thinking economically, men can marry down for their partnership, while women tend to marry up. And in terms of education, historically, white men were more educated than white women. Where you see the cross happening is in the 1960s. And of course, we know what happened in the 1960s. That's when there were civil rights movements, but for white women particularly, that's when white women were able to move out the home and not face the same social sanctions. They were better able to go to school. And you saw that being divorced, etc., was more acceptable for white women at that period. So you saw this shift in education. So you see that white women became more educated in marriages than white men starting around the 1960s. And you can see that trend continue. Now for Black couples, Black women have typically had higher rates of education than Black men. And there's for a couple of reasons. Now historically, it had a lot to do with the type of jobs. So Black men historically, prior to, we say even right up to the 80s, you'll find that you were able to make a decent living and be able to support a family, even if you were working in positions that today we wouldn't consider this way. So being in the military or working in factories, that you had a living wage. And so you were able to work in these types of jobs that did not require a degree, but were really sort of male defined for Black men. And so the Black men did not necessarily need the education in the same way. For Black women who were middle class, you were more likely to have jobs like being a teacher or a social worker, which required some level of a degree. So even though we saw this disparity between Black men and Black women in terms of their education historically, when you looked at it in terms of jobs and economic stability, it still fit and maintained appropriate gender roles around who's contributing to the family in what way. Where you see the biggest shift, though, is, of course, as we move forward into the 70s and 80s. And what's happened is Black men's rates of education and completing degrees just continues to decrease. And it's becoming more and more of a problem because jobs that traditionally Black males were able to hold or were allowed to hold that did provide a living wage no longer exist. You can also see this in terms of marriage trends by education, in terms of who is married, who's not married, etc. So if you're looking at the first column to the left, which is white women, you'll see that 38% of women who are white are never married. But overall, white women are more likely to marry up or than they are to marry down. So 29% married up and just 27% married down. So it's a bit lower. But 6% were were previously married, but no longer married at this point. So you're seeing almost 66% or over 60% of white women are married in some way, whether it's up or down or previously married, which has implications, again, for economic stability. In contrast, if you look at Black women, only 13% marry up and 19% marry down. So there you're finding just over 30% are married and 8% were previously married. So 40% were married at some point, as compared to 60% who've never been married. So you could see that this education trend has a huge impact. And I remember my first day of my doctoral degree, my professor, one of them was an African-American woman, and we were talking about marriage gradients. It was a human development program. And she said, you know, the more educated you are as a woman of color, the less likely you are to get married. And I remember being frozen when she said it, but it plays out here when you look at the research. So the more educated you are, what's really happening is that the dating pool for Black women who would like to be married to college-educated Black men is relatively small. And as we go along, we'll discuss the implications for that in terms of broader sexual health outcomes. And so what we're really talking about is the way that these cultural factors have direct implications on college-educated Black women's decision-making around their sexual health. So again, think about it. When you're thinking about your ability to have social mobility, and there's fewer male partners with equal income and education, then you have to deal with the gender roles that we have about who's supposed to make money, how do you negotiate this, what are the expectations. So this will then impact what people are willing to do within a relationship, particularly when I say people, Black women. So when you have this perceived belief about limited pool of partners tied to education and income, and also just if you want to specifically marry Black men, you have to start thinking about the ways in which compromise might impact some of the decision-making that's taking place for these women who we do see as having more resources and having more education. Therefore, it's assumed that they'll be less likely to be at risk, even though it doesn't hold true in the literature. So as we said earlier, we've discussed this a lot in popular culture. As you see, there's films, and it's discussed a lot in terms of movies, and there's several books that have become popular over the years discussing Black women's experiences with dating and partner availability. And of course, there's a lot of news reports that have been framing this issue in really sort of specific ways. But what we've done less of, and I think is one of the issues that we need to focus on, is by focusing on the empirical evidence and also sorting out which is good science and which is junk science. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So one of the ways I think it's critical to look at this is from a theoretical lens. And this is actually something that my doctoral student did with her thesis project, was that she took the scarcity model of social effects to examine college-educated Black women's risk for sexual negative outcomes. And the scarcity model was really framed around economics, so that it goes with this belief that scarcity increases people's negative emotions. And it sort of frames people to become depressed or have anxiety. And this then, of course, affects our decision-making processes. And so when we're feeling sort of stressed, or we feel that there's not enough environmental or resources available, we make decisions in a way that might not be the most healthiest for long term. So the research in most of this is really focused on the cycle of poverty. So when there is scarcity, people think short term, and people then make decisions that don't really benefit them in the long term, which helps maintain this sort of system of poverty and keeping people in place. So if you look at the idea of the sources of environmental scarcity here, this could be anything. It basically decreases the quality and quantity of renewable resources, something that's always there, but the population that wants it keeps growing. And then there's also, of course, an inequality in terms of people's ability to access these few resources. And then again, this then again increases scarcity even more. And so when you're looking at this, this also leads to economic disruptions and stress, and this then of course weakens the social fabric and decision-making that happens. And again, this again was primarily done in an economic sort of framework when you're looking at issues around poverty, issues around conflict, issues around political instability. What was really interesting was that Brittany Boyd shifted this and framed it to Black college women's sexual health in her paper here. And what she looked at was partner scarcity specifically, and the idea of unlimited resources in terms of limited wants, which would be the number of Black women who want ideal partners, and the limited resources were economically stable college Black men. And then this then shaped their perceptions of ideal male partner availability, which then of course shifted their decision-making and behavioral outcomes in terms of their willingness to compromise in or for an intimate relationship, and then of course their risk for negative sexual health outcomes. And so what we're really going to focus on in this lecture is the idea of the sources of partner scarcity and how this affects women's perceptions. If you want to really look at how this then shifted to compromising in relationships and engagement behaviors, I encourage you to read this paper by Brittany Boyd. And at the end, of course, we'll provide you with links to resources to this paper and other similar papers, as it's really this empirically based look at this phenomenon in terms of scarcity and using this theoretical framework. So when you're looking at this idea of partner availability and how it affects Black women in college, we look at the narratives, and it really focuses, as we talked about earlier, the idea about educational attainment differentials, and also dating and interracial dating, or even dating within the group, and how this then affects the ways in which women look at their partner availability pool. And so these two phenomena are what we're going to be looking at in this first phase here. So I want to start off by looking at the concept of educational attainment differentials. And this sort of goes back to what we talked about earlier, and that's because we know that education, in terms of formal education, is really what sort of drives and predicts the likelihood of you reaching certain economic levels and also social status levels. And this is when you look at the research that links to literacy, unemployment, and household income. We look at formal education, there's a strong correlation between the two. And even for when you're thinking about it as an individual Black woman who receives high levels of education, her ability for economic mobility is really tied to having a partner that can contribute to this in terms of increasing her financial stability and achieving long-term life goals. Because as we know, for economic stability today and reaching middle-class lifestyle goals in a real sort of firm way, you do need two incomes, and two incomes at a certain level. Now, we talked about this again earlier about college education by race and gender, and we talked about where males and females are crossing. But if you're looking from the 1940s again, you're seeing that Black women's trends have really increased. But overall, historically, white men were more educated than white women, and as I talked about earlier, you saw similarities in the 1950s to 60s, where you saw women increasing and white men's rates still going up, but not as great a divergence from white women's. But white women surpassed white men in the 90s. But if you're looking at by race and ethnic group, Black women and Black men were equally educated from until the 1980s. And suddenly in the 80s, you saw a huge shift in terms of Black women's trajectories versus Black men. Black men did bounce back in the early 2000s, but then it decreased again around 2008. But you saw that there's been a divergence in terms of college education by race between Black men and Black women in the 80s. And that, again, coincided with a lot of social changes in terms of poverty, economic, the criminal justice system, the military, that really shifted why Black men were able to access or even persist in college in a way that Black women were able to, and Black men had these differential experiences. So if we look at it today, when we're looking at the percentage of Black women versus Black men who have actually attended and then completed college, it's very different. So you see 57% of Black women have actually attended college. That means they've started some level of degree. Of those 57% that have attended, which is actually a larger number, 31% of them actually complete their degrees. So 57% of Black women actually attend college or university or started, but 31% of that 50% actually complete a degree. Again, Black men, 58% attend or start, but only 17%, so almost half of the number of Black women actually complete undergraduate degrees. And when you look at this across degree type, you can also see that there's huge disparities. So Black men are receiving almost half the number of associate's and bachelor degrees as compared to Black women. So Black men have been receiving, let me start again. So and now if you look at it in terms of degrees, you'll see that Black men have been receiving about half the amount of associate and bachelor degrees as Black women. In master's degrees, Black men outnumber Black women. But again, when you think about master's degrees, you should think about what kinds of degrees are existing there. But when it comes to doctoral degrees, which is the higher rate, you're seeing, again, Black women are outnumbering Black men. So again, when you're looking at these differentials by gender, think about them in terms of partner availability and gender role expectations and relationships as it ties to education, economic, and social mobility beliefs. So this now shifts to the concept of interracial dating. And really, when we're thinking about this, this would be important to think about, as the research does show generally, people tend to marry within your race, and that's common across all groups. So as we talked about earlier, Black men and Black women are more likely to marry another Black man or Black woman, and this holds true when you're looking at whites, Hispanics, and Asians, but we're beginning to see a greater increase in interracial dating. And if you think about this in terms of our discussion of partner availability, if you're willing to date interracially, this would increase your pools. But when you're looking at it for Black women, you're seeing that their rates have increased over the past 30 years. But if you're looking at overall, Blacks still do date interracially at a lower rate than other racial groups. And part of this has to do with the ideas about race status exchange, in which having a partner from a higher economic or social status group, which typically reads as being white, means a greater level of social mobility. And so there's a sort of value around this that makes people uncomfortable, and also has a backlash within communities that really shape Black women's experiences around these, and also Black males, which are very different. And if you think about the lecture I've done earlier on skin color, we can think about the ways in which race and ideas about beauty and identity are very different for women versus men when it comes to the ideas about interracial dating. And I'll discuss this a little bit more as I go on here. So let's first look at Black men. So overall, when you're looking at Black males, Black male newlyweds are twice as likely to have a partner of another race. But overall, 75% of recently Black men were married to Black women. So this narrative of Black men primarily marrying women of other races is not necessarily accurate, as more than 3/4 are still marrying Black women, but they are more likely and more open to marrying women of other races. So the numbers are not significant, but we're probably going to see an increased trend. And some of the research have noted that this might have to do with social pressures. Because first and foremost, the idea for Black men marrying outside the race might not have the same social sanctions. So bringing a partner of a different race for a Black male might not have the same pushback from their family, or might not have the same pushback when from others in their shared Black community spaces as Black females do. So again, if you saw the movie Something New, which we start off this lecture with, if you see the whole movie, the perceptions and expectations that she experienced when she had her white male partner were very different than when she had a black male partner. But if a black male had a white female partner, there's usually a very different framework around how that's looked at in terms of cultural sanctions. And this has a lot to do with the ways in which Black women have been socialized to marry, date, and have children by men of the same race. And so this then shapes ideas about who Black women should marry and the expectations and social pressures they face around this. And this again then will also shape why you're finding why Black women might be more reluctant to date partners outside their race versus women with other groups. So again, you find that Black women are the least likely group to date men outside their race. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which we'll talk about. So if you're looking at it, Black women who attend historically Black colleges and universities are less likely to be supportive of interracial dating than Black women who attend predominantly white institutions. But across all groups, again, both types of institutions, Black women are less favorable of interracial dating attitudes. But this institutional difference, again, would tie into partner availability. If you're attending an HBCU, you're more likely to have more Black male partners, and you might not have the same pool or feel the same pressures to date males of other races than Black women, college women who are predominantly white universities. So that's an important thing to think about when you're looking at this factor here. The other factor to think about is the concept of cultural mistrust. And what they find is that Black women might experience higher levels of cultural mistrust that influence their willingness to date men of other races. And when you're thinking about cultural mistrust, it has to do with your experience with discrimination, your experience with prejudice, and attitudes you receive towards yourself around being a Black female. And so this might leave the choice of only dating African-American men or Black men or not dating at all. Another tie that ties into here that's important to think about is that Black women, again, then might, if they want to date a Black male, would have to marry a Black male or feel the pressure who is lower than them on the marriage gradient in terms of economics or educational status, or again, not marry at all. And so the social pressures they might feel will shape their attitudes around doing this. And these are the things that have to be addressed. But the last piece is tying into that even if a Black woman did want to date a male of another racial ethnic group, there are a lot of bodies of research that highlight attitudes around how they're perceived by men of other groups really shape their ability to do so, and also their willingness. So the research has shown that men of other racial ethnic groups are least likely to date Black women as compared to white or Asian women, and they're more likely to date rate Black women as less attractive. And again, this has a lot to do with the stereotypes and the frameworks of perceptions around dating Black women. And we as researchers have a lot to do with this in terms of how we frame our research and the way it's been reported, because the narrative research is showing that this is not necessarily true, but the ways in terms of questions are being asked and how a lot of stereotypes and attitudes around Black womanhood are pushed in the media and popular culture narratives reinforce these stereotypes. One of the greatest things that, one of the most popular issues that happened most recently was a pseudoscience of the Black women are less attractive study that was done by a London School of Economics professor. And it was published in Psychology Today. And the professor's name was Satoshi Konwanza, which is funny when I'm looking at it, it sounds almost close to Kwanzaa. And he's an evolutionary psychologist. And he has a blog in Psychology Today where he framed Black women as saying that they are objectively and subjectively uglier than white, Asian, and Native American women. And this was a widely published study and repeated over and over again. But the reality is that this was actually incorrect, and it's viewed now as pseudoscience. The methods he used, the data collection, and even the analysis were found to be significantly flawed. And it was called out by the American Psychological Association and other widely recognized as legitimate psychology and science associations to be flawed and pseudoscience. But although it's completely untrue, people still talk about it and reference this as a study that proved, and even this has implications for how Black women see themselves in terms of attractiveness, and of course then can influence their expectations and willingness to date partners that are not of the same race. So going back to the scarcity model that was modified by Brittany Boyd, these ideas about unlimited wants and unlimited resources and how it affects Black women's perceptions of partner availability really has implications for thinking about Black women's willingness to compromise and negative sexual health outcomes as a result of this. So when you're thinking about this in terms of the next phase, we can look at the research around certain aspects of sexual health negative outcomes and think about how these sort of perceptions, which the research is showing is not actually true, because again, when we're looking at the research about desire to get married, Black men not necessarily marrying women outside the group, and that there are lots of males of other races that are willing to marry and date Black women and willingness to marry interracially, but these perceptions are really shaping ideal partner availability beliefs, and then these in turn are shaping women's willingness to compromise and in turn their sexual risk. And so to do this piece in this section on sexual risk, what we're going to look at is the research around compromise and sexual risk, particularly as it relates to our ideas about multiple or shared partnerships or infidelity more broadly, condom usage, and intimate partner violence. So I want to be clear that we're not just taking a leap from here, but it's important to think back in terms of generally how women are socialized to be in relationships. So when you're thinking about women's willingness to negotiate in relationships, women have often been socialized that to find a partner, also their role is to be the peacekeepers and engage in the relational work to maintain a relationship. And that's not just in terms of intimate relationships, but even relationships at work and relationships with their children, etc. So if women are trying to maintain peace and negotiate relationships as it relates to intimate partners, and they feel particularly vulnerable that there are not enough partners or their partner can easily leave them and find someone else, they're more likely to compromise in ways that might not be healthy and put them at risk. And this is what it's important to think about when we're talking about compromise and its relationship to sexual risk. So again, the first thing we're going to talk about is the concept of multiple or shared partners. And what they found is a national study, and this is across the board, that men's educational level is positively linked to the likelihood that they're going to cheat on their partner. And if you're looking at it here in terms of self-reports, it is, the research has found that Black men are more likely to report cheating with someone than their spouse, but it's 28% versus 20% of white and 16% of Hispanic men. But what they found is that people with the highest levels and the lowest levels of education are the ones who are most likely to cheat. So there is a link between education that we can't ignore. But when we're looking at a study, Boyd's research, what she found was that in her study with graduate women, a third of the women in her study acknowledged that they were engaging in relationships with partners who might have had partners themselves. So they didn't necessarily ask, but they either knew or suspected that their partner had multiple or other partners at the same time, but they felt they had to stay in this relationship because they need to compromise to maintain the relationship and maintain this partner. And this, of course, fits with the broader research of what we know about research that's found that women across the board who are concerned about partner availability are more likely to ignore monogamy or infidelity with their partner. And this, of course, in turn lowers their willingness to request that a condom is being used during intimacy. And we're going to talk about condom usage in a second. And it's important, of course, to think about the fact that concurrent partner relationships or having a partner who has multiple partners, whether before you're in the relationship or during the relationship, is significantly correlated with your risk for HIV and other STIs. And what you find that women who define casual sex, and meaning having partners who they're not in necessarily monogamous relationships with, are more likely to have an understand their risk for negative sexual outcomes, and they prefer to be in monogamous relationships. So women are designed to be in monogamous relationships, and so they're trying to make these relationships work, even if it means putting themselves at sexual risk. And so, of course, you're going to desire and work to try and make these relationships work if you feel that there are fewer partners and you need to make the compromise on this one dynamic, as it means that you might not have a partner otherwise if you don't do this. So condom usage for Black college women, they found, is really dependent on several factors, particularly their partner's usage. So Black college women who perceive that their partner does not want them to use condoms are less likely to use them, even if they themselves want to use it or feel that they should. But their fears around losing the partner, upsetting the partner, will decrease their willingness to push or negotiate condom usage. Also, if you've never talked about condom usage with your partner, it increases their inconsistent use of condom usage. So women who have talked about condom usage with their partner are more likely to be able to insist on consistent condom use with their partners. But again, if you feel like you want to maintain this relationship and having discussions about condom usage can add some sort of tension in the relationship, you're probably less likely to use this than even trying to push it further. So again, this ties into the research that shows when women have a lower sexual power, lower sexual relationship power, they're less likely to use condoms. So if you feel that you don't have power in the relationship or you don't feel empowered enough to speak out, you're less likely to push for condom usage. But women who perceive monogamy as important, that really shifts their willingness to engage in condom usage or request it. So if your partner is telling you that he's monogamous and is more negative towards condom usage and says that and gives indications that you're pushing for condom usage is tied to whether or not the relationship will continue or be monogamous, will shape a woman's willingness to use this. And the research shows that sexually non-assertive Black women are going to be more likely to follow partners' condom use preferences. And that makes complete sense given your fears around wanting to maintain your relationship with your partner. So related to condom use is intimate partner violence, IPV. And what you also find is that women's negotiative condoms are also tied to their risk for IPV. But when you're thinking about it overall, Black women have high rates of violent victimization. In fact, intimate partner violence accounts for almost 20% or over 20% of the violent victimizations reported against Black women nationwide. And the National Crime Victimization Survey actually found that Black women who graduated from college or had additional education beyond a 4-year degree, so those are women who are in graduate school, reported having more sexual and other forms of abuse than those women who had not completed high school. So in this case, we can see that IPV for Black women is linked to having higher education. And part of this also can tie to the fact that college enrollment can elevate a woman's level of risk for IPV. One, college settings increase risks for IPV across all groups of women. But what they have found in other studies is that if a college woman is going to school and her partner is not, it could be threatening to their partner. And if that partner tries to limit or control her experience in college or even threatened by what college could mean in terms of her achievement and attending college, it can increase her risk for intimate partner violence victimization. So when you're also thinking about this with verbal coercion, you can also think about how it's also tied to women's higher risk for sexually transmitted risk and IPV. So verbal sexual coercion is pressure to have sex or threats to have sex. And what you find is that this is something that Black women have high rates of experiencing too, is verbal sexual coercion. So women who are less assertive are going to feel this more often. And when we're talking about this verbal sexual coercion, this is actually very common because when you think about it, it's the stepping stones to other types of violence. So no male usually is going to hit you on the first date because if that happened, you don't have a connection to them. Instead, there's a grooming process, or like anything else, it's going to build up to a relationship till you're invested. And so what you find is that verbal sexual coercion is what links into higher rates of more severe forms of physical sexual coercion. And you're finding this, it happens at high rates among highly educated Black women. And so this has links to other forms of negative sexual health outcome, because then Black women who experience physical forms of intimate partner violence are less likely to use condoms than those women who don't experience sexual violence at all. So relationship power, fear of abuse, and being dependent on your partner or feeling that you have to compromise and fearful of losing that partner and even using condom use is very common among women who've experienced high levels of intimate partner violence. And of course, this has implications for other forms of sexual negative outcomes as well. And this is an area that we haven't done a lot of research on in terms of partner availability and sexual violence, in terms of finding an exact relationship, but there is a lot of this type of correlational research out there that needs to be explored in the future. Now, there's important points that we need to consider is that first and foremost, what I've been presenting here is really focused on heterosexual relationships. So we need to look at this more broadly in terms of sexual diversity and looking at experience of lesbian, trans, bisexual, pansexual, Black women, and also Black women who are consenting to be in open relationships. Also, we're looking at this in terms of college-educated women and also women who are in graduate level degrees or higher levels of education. And there are very different experiences tied there. And also even versus college women who've just started college versus women who are about to graduate, because these sort of developmental stages really shift where you are in terms of how you're thinking about relationships and even your partner availability. Also, cultural contexts are important to consider because these women, again, developmentally dating versus going out, willingness to forgo marriage and being single longer, these are shifting attitudes. And again, we also talked about whether you're at an HBCU or predominantly white institution will shift your understanding. Another key thing are issues around your career focus. So I know in Brittany Boy's study, women that were focused more immediately on their long-term career versus those who were thinking more about having children and settling down had very different ideas about relationships and their willingness to compromise, and that needs to be thought about as well. And then finally, sources of social pressure. This has to be thought about here in terms of who's pressuring you to get married, why do you need to get pressure? Is also what kinds of pressures are Black women facing about race, maybe even religion, and it might not be as much as race, but also nationality. So are you being pressured to marry a Afro-Latino man versus a Caribbean man versus an African man versus an African-American man? Does he have to be someone from your neighborhood, or could he be from somewhere else? And all of these things need to be considered when you're thinking about issues related to diversity around Black women's experiences as college-educated women and sexual risk-taking and compromise and partner availability. So this is the next step in terms of where we want to go, is looking at within group differences and also doing research that specifically ties in our attitudes towards partner availability and sexual risk in a real sort of concrete way. Clearly, there's a lot of things that weren't covered and a lot of things to tie in here. But there's a lot of things that we have to do as researchers to start addressing this more broadly, which includes obviously using this intersectional lens, but also thinking about the ways in which we're looking at. And I think the first thing is start looking at interventions. And part of this is focusing on the ways in which we frame intimate relationships and the ways in which we talk about this. And this has to encompass beyond just looking at partner availability and interracial dating and who you want to date, but also start thinking about identities such as nationality, our identities around beauty, our identities around religion, tying in our values, but most importantly, personal agency. What empowerment, what frameworks, what kinds of tools do Black women have for addressing these things and looking at them within their life events, their life goals, and their ability to change the consequences and their experiences. And universities also have to start addressing this more broadly because we tend to just look at college students and not really create a lot of social opportunities that are unique for undergraduate and graduate students to not just simply look at partnerships, but engage in critical discussions around intimacy and intimate relationships that integrate their experiences as racial ethnic minority women, but also racial ethnic minority women on campus and their partnerships beyond the walls of the campus as well. There's a limit in the research that's focusing on college students of color, despite the fact that they are the fastest growing group on campus, and they're at a critically important time for developing their long-term relationships. And so it's important that we keep doing research in this area to start improving the experiences of students of color, and particularly Black women as college women, as the research has shown, again, they're the most educated population in the United States numerically, and they're continuing to go in this way, and the trends around education don't seem to be changing anytime soon. That's going to affect them long term in terms of their economic stability, social mobility, and intimate partner relationships.
Thanks for joining us at this intersection, where we bring together the real world and the world of research. If you'd like more information about this topic, including additional readings or related videos, please just visit my website, dionstevens.com.